After spending 30 years on Alabama's death row, 54-year-old Anthony Todd Boyd took his final breath on the evening of October 23, 2025. Strapped to a gurney in the death chamber at William C. Holman Correctional Facility, Boyd was executed by nitrogen gas, a controversial new method of capital punishment. At 6:33 p.m. that night, the warden pronounced him dead, but not before Boyd uttered a final, defiant proclamation of innocence. This is the harrowing true story of the crime that put him on death row, the decades that followed, and the chilling finale that has captivated the nation. On July 31, 1993, a crime in Talladega County, Alabama, sent shockwaves through the small community of Munford. That evening, 26-year-old Gregory Huguley was kidnapped at gunpoint over what seemed like a trivial dispute, an unpaid $200 cocaine debt. But what followed was no ordinary act of vengeance. It was an execution carried out with cruelty so extreme, it would forever be remembered as one of Alabama's most horrifying murders. The crime began when Anthony Todd Boyd, along with 3 accomplices, Sean Ingram, Marcel Monique Ackles, and Kinty Cox, decided to confront Huguley about the debt. The 4 men tracked him down in Anniston, driving a blue van Ackles had rented earlier that day. When they spotted Huguley, they forced him into the van at gunpoint, using a 9mm Mac 11 pistol provided by Cox. As they drove away, the tone turned sinister. This wasn't about collecting money anymore. It was about sending a brutal message. During the drive, they stopped at a local gas station where Ackles purchased a can of gasoline, the tool that would soon turn an act of intimidation into a murder scene. The group then drove deep into the rural outskirts of Munford, stopping at an empty baseball field surrounded by trees and silence. There, they dragged Huguley out of the van, ignoring his pleas for mercy. They taped his hands and mouth, and Boyd wrapped duct tape around his feet, binding him to a park bench like a prisoner awaiting punishment. Sean Ingram, still armed, poured gasoline over Huguley's body and along a short trail leading back to the can. With one final spark, Ingram ignited the gasoline. Flames rushed along the trail, and within seconds, Huguley was engulfed in fire, alive and screaming. The men stood there watching as the blaze consumed him, his desperate cries echoing through the still night until they faded into silence. It was over in minutes, but the terror of that act would linger for decades. When police discovered Huguley's charred remains the next morning, August 1, 1993, the evidence spoke of unimaginable suffering. Investigators later described the scene as one of deliberate torture. A man burned alive over a $200 debt. One witness recalled, "They didn't just kill him, they made him suffer." In the aftermath, the story that emerged painted a chilling portrait of greed, vengeance, and peer pressure gone deadly. Each man had played a role, Ackles as the planner and supplier, Cox as the driver and state witness, Ingram as the executioner, and Boyd as the enforcer who helped restrain the victim. But it was Boyd who would ultimately pay the ultimate price. All over a mere $200, a young man's life was reduced to ashes on a lonely Alabama field. And 3 decades later, that fire would still burn in the memories of everyone who knew him. By 1995, Anthony Todd Boyd was on trial for capital murder during a kidnapping in connection with Huguley's death. Prosecutors painted Boyd as an active and full participant in the killing. A key prosecution witness, one of Boyd's co-defendants, testified under a plea deal that Boyd tied the victim's feet with tape moments before another man poured the gasoline and lit the flame. This testimony was pivotal, as no physical evidence linked Boyd directly to the scene. Boyd's defense argued he was at a party that night and that the accomplice's story was unreliable. Despite these claims of innocence, a jury found Boyd guilty of Huguley's murder. In Alabama, a death sentence does not even require a unanimous jury, and in Boyd's case, The jury voted 10-2 in favor of execution. The judge affirmed the death penalty, sending the 24-year-old Boyd to death row in 1995. Boyd maintained his innocence from that day forward, insisting he never killed nor intended to kill Gregory Huguley. Weeks turned into months, then years and decades, as Anthony Boyd languished on death row. By all accounts, he exhausted every legal avenue to save his life during those 30 years. Appeal after appeal wound through the courts, but the verdict and sentence stood. Boyd became active in prison, even chairing Project Hope to abolish the death penalty, an inmate-founded anti-capital punishment group. Ironically, the man condemned to die became a vocal advocate against execution. Over the years, Alabama's execution methods also changed. As lethal injection drugs became hard to obtain, the state approved a novel execution method, nitrogen hypoxia. In 2018, inmates were given a one-time choice to opt into nitrogen as their execution method, and Boyd initially signed up for it. But as his own execution drew nearer, Boyd grew fearful of this untested procedure. He begged to be executed by firing squad instead, arguing a bullet would kill him in seconds, whereas nitrogen gas could mean a prolonged, torturous death. That request was denied. Alabama insisted on using nitrogen, touting it as a quick and humane alternative to injection, an assertion many experts and Boyd's team fiercely disputed. In the final days before the execution, last-minute legal drama heightened the suspense. Boyd's attorneys challenged the nitrogen gas protocol as cruel and unusual punishment, citing evidence from earlier nitrogen executions where prisoners shook and gasped for air on the gurney. These appeals went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. Mere hours before Boyd's scheduled death, the court declined to intervene, clearing the way for the execution to proceed. In a scathing dissent, Justice Sonia Sotomayor warned what was about to happen. Boyd asks for the barest form of mercy, to die by firing squad, rather than by a torturous suffocation lasting up to 4 minutes. She urged the public to imagine the horror of being conscious and unable to breathe for minutes on end. But the majority of the court turned a deaf ear, and the execution was set in motion. October 23, 2025, Execution Day. Anthony Boyd spent his last full day alive visiting with family and saying goodbye. According to prison officials, he met with several visitors, including his 2 daughters, and made a few final phone calls. When offered the customary special last meal, Boyd refused it. In fact, records show he ate only a normal breakfast that Thursday and declined lunch and dinner, opting not to make any final meal request. Perhaps it was a final act of resolve or protest. He would meet his fate on his own terms, with no Last Supper. That evening, Boyd was brought to Holman's stark execution chamber. Witnesses, including journalists and Boyd's own brother, watched from behind glass as officials prepared to carry out the sentence. Boyd himself appeared calm. He even managed a small smile and a thumbs up toward his family in the witness room as the procedure began. When the warden asked if he had any final words, Boyd seized the moment. In a steady voice, he gave a passionate last statement that echoed through the chamber. "I didn't kill anybody. I didn't participate in killing anybody," he insisted, standing by his innocence one last time. He condemned what was about to happen, declaring, "There is no justice in this state. It's all political. It's all revenge-motivated." Boyd argued that an execution brings no true closure. Closure comes from within, not an execution. In his final breaths, he spoke directly to his supporters and loved ones, telling them, "Keep fighting. I love every single one of y'all." He then closed with a defiant rallying cry, "Let's get it." Those 5 words, "Let's get it," were the last Anthony Todd Boyd ever spoke. In that moment, he seemed less like a man defeated and more like a man urging others to continue the battle he could no longer fight. There was no apology to the victim's family in his final remarks, only unwavering claims of innocence and a scathing critique of the system that brought him here. Moments after Boyd's final statement, at approximately 5:55 p.m., prison officials placed a blue gas mask firmly over his face. This mask was connected to a supply of pure nitrogen, ready to displace all oxygen. The witnesses fell into an uneasy silence. Then the execution began. For the first few seconds, nothing happened. Then witnesses saw Anthony Boyd's body jolt. At about 5:57 p.m., he clenched his fist and lifted his head slightly against the straps. Suddenly, his body began to convulse. His back arched, and his legs even rose a few inches off the gurney as he thrashed against the restraints. His eyes rolled back. The chaplain, Reverend Jeff Wood, stood at Boyd's feet, holding his hand and quietly praying, tracing the sign of the cross in the air. Some witnesses pressed forward, straining to see, until a guard ordered them to sit back and stay quiet. It looked as if Boyd was fighting for breath, and indeed he was. By 6:01 p.m., Boyd's violent movements had subsided, but a far more haunting struggle had begun. He started taking a deep, heaving breath, then another and another. These gasping breaths were loud enough that reporters could actually hear each desperate inhale, and began counting them. Boyd's chest heaved, and his head jerked with each gasp. Minute after agonizing minute ticked by, and still he kept breathing, drawing in nitrogen, devoid of oxygen, in what looked like the body's frantic fight to stay alive. Witnesses later reported that Boyd gasped over 225 times before his body finally gave up. At one point, Boyd's brother, unable to contain himself as he watched this prolonged agony, burst out, "It's like he's gasping for air." He could only shake his head in horror at what he saw. The harrowing spectacle continued for over 15 minutes. Media witnesses described it as the longest, most drawn-out execution they had ever seen. Reverend Hood, the spiritual advisor, later said, "This is the worst one yet." He believed Boyd remained conscious and suffering for at least 16 minutes of the procedure. Finally, sometime after 6:15 p.m., Anthony Boyd's gasps grew shallow. His eyes had closed. His body settled into eerie stillness. At 6:27 p.m., prison officials drew the curtain, blocking the witnesses' view. A few minutes later, a spokesperson announced that Anthony Todd Boyd was officially dead at 6:33 p.m. The execution that Justice Sotomayor had warned would last up to 4 minutes had in reality stretched nearly 20 minutes from the first gas flow to the pronouncement of death. It was the longest nitrogen gas execution in U.S. history up to that point. Prison authorities later insisted that any shaking or gasping seen during these executions are largely involuntary reflexes caused by oxygen deprivation, not conscious suffering. Alabama's Corrections Commissioner John Hamm acknowledged Boyd's execution took longer than previous ones, but downplayed the difference as just a few minutes more. To observers, however, what happened to Boyd looked like a man suffocating in slow motion. The controversial nitrogen method, touted by its proponents as a peaceful way to die, instead appeared to deliver prolonged torment before the eyes of everyone present. In the lethal aftermath, officials in Alabama were resolute. Governor Kay Ivey issued a statement emphasizing that after 30 years of legal delays, justice had finally been served. After 30 years on death row, Anthony Boyd's death sentence has been carried out, and his victim's family has finally received justice, Ivey announced. Alabama Attorney General Steve Marshall likewise praised the outcome, noting that for 3 decades, Boyd never produced evidence to overturn his conviction. Gregory Huguley was never afforded the chance to delay his own brutal and untimely death, Marshall pointed out, underscoring the state's view that Boyd's punishment was well-deserved. State officials expressed hope that Huguley's family can now find peace, knowing the man held responsible for his murder has been executed. Yet, in a poignant detail, no one from Gregory Huguley's family came to witness the execution. Prison officials reported that none of the victims' relatives were present in the viewing room, nor did they issue any public statement that night. After so many years, perhaps the wounds were too deep to reopen, or perhaps, for them, the case had closed long ago. Instead, the final scene in the execution chamber was observed mainly by journalists, prison officials, and Boyd's own supporters. Boyd's brother and daughters left the prison grounds in tearful silence, having watched the state take a life in their presence. The case of Anthony Todd Boyd is sure to leave a lasting impact on the true crime and legal communities. It highlights the uncomfortable mirror that capital punishment can hold up to the crimes it seeks to punish. Boyd's victim, Gregory Huguley, died in terror and pain, burned alive by his captors. Decades later, Anthony Boyd died in terror and pain as well, suffocating on a gurney at the hands of the state. Many will argue that this symmetry is justice, a life for a life, and a horror for a horror. Others see it as a grim indictment of the death penalty itself, especially when implemented through an experimental procedure that some have likened to torture. Even now, questions persist about Boyd's level of involvement in the crime and the fairness of his trial, given the lack of physical evidence and his unwavering claims of innocence. What is undeniable is the finality of what occurred. Anthony Todd Boyd is dead, and the sentence that was pronounced 30 years ago has been fulfilled. For the family of Gregory Huguley, there is the knowledge that the man convicted in his killing paid the ultimate price. For Boyd's family and supporters, there is grief and anger at the manner of his death and the system they feel failed him. For the public, the execution raises haunting imagery. A man gasping for breath 225 times in a sealed chamber, a process cloaked in secrecy with a curtain finally drawn on suffering. The execution of Anthony Todd Boyd will be remembered not only for its chilling procedural firsts, but for the unsettling story it tells about retribution, suffering, and the depths of human cruelty on both sides of the law. In the words of Governor Ivey, justice has been served. Yet, in the heavy air that lingers after the execution, we are reminded that true closure remains as elusive as ever.